The Canadian economy, already contending with inflation, tariffs, and a cost of living crisis, is also watching a steady and ongoing slump in the housing market.
What happens when a city discovers it doesn't have the money to build the infrastructure needed for 100,000 approved housing projects? What happens when the mayor stands in front of cameras and admits there's a $300 million hole in the budget with no clear solution? And what happens when developers, investors, and construction firms realize the entire financing system they've relied on for decades has completely collapsed? This isn't a hypothetical crisis brewing somewhere in the future. This is happening right now in Vancouver. And the decisions made in the next few months will determine whether 100,000 shovel-ready housing projects ever get built or whether they become the largest failed development disaster in Canadian history. Subscribe right now and hit that like button because what I'm about to reveal shows exactly how. Vancouver's 2026 budget just became a financial time bomb that could destroy the city's ability to deliver the housing supply it desperately needs. The numbers are absolutely devastating, and nobody in government wants to talk about them openly. According to Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation data released earlier this year, approximately 100,000 approved housing projects across Metro Vancouver sit completely stalled due to financial constraints. These aren't proposals floating around on someone's desk. These aren't dreams or concepts. These are shovel-ready developments with full municipal approvals, engineering plans, architectural designs, and construction permits. Everything is ready to go, except the financing doesn't work anymore. At the exact same time, Vancouver's 2026 budget reveals a $300 million infrastructure deficit for essential services like sidewalks, water systems, sewer capacity, and community facilities. The mayor confirmed this figure in multiple interviews conducted over the past 2 weeks, and his tone wasn't optimistic. It was frustrated, almost angry. But here's where this crisis transforms from bad to catastrophic. The budget also freezes certain municipal revenue streams while simultaneously cutting funding to planning and development departments by 14%. Think about that for a second. The city is facing the biggest housing crisis in its history. 100,000 approved projects are stuck, and the response is to cut the departments responsible for processing development applications and coordinating infrastructure planning by 14%. Industry analysts are now connecting these data points and reaching a conclusion that should terrify every homeowner, developer, and investor in British Columbia. If the infrastructure money doesn't materialize and development charges remain at current levels, the financial viability of those 100,000 stalled projects could deteriorate from difficult to absolutely impossible. Subscribe now because the financing mechanisms I'm about to explain will show you exactly why this isn't just a Vancouver problem. It's a blueprint for what's coming to every major Canadian city. To understand why this matters, you need to understand how residential development financing actually works in Vancouver. Developers don't build on hope or optimism. They build on numbers, cold, hard mathematics, and those numbers have become increasingly brutal over the past 3 years. According to the Urban Development Institute, construction costs in Metro Vancouver now exceed what 80% of local residents can afford to pay. Let that sink in. The cost to build housing is higher than what 80% of the people living in the city can afford. Industry experts estimate developers need to deliver housing at $700 to $900 per square foot to make units accessible to median income buyers. But current all-in costs, including land acquisition, materials, labor, permits, and development charges, push finished units to $1,100 to $1,200 per square foot or higher. That gap isn't theoretical. It's destroying projects across the entire region right now. The infrastructure deficit adds another devastating layer of complexity. When municipalities lack funds for essential services, they typically pass those costs to developers through higher development charges and community amenity contributions. But developers are already underwater on project economics. According to interviews with industry leaders published in Business in Vancouver, many firms describe current projects as financially unviable even before factoring in additional cost increases. This creates what economists call a death spiral. Projects need infrastructure to function. Infrastructure needs funding. Funding comes from development charges, but development charges make projects economically impossible. So projects stall, which means no new infrastructure funding gets generated, which makes future projects even less viable. The cycle feeds itself, getting worse with every rotation. Hit that like button because what I'm revealing next about the 2026 budget shows exactly why city officials are quietly panicking behind closed doors. The 2026 budget proposal emerged in early November with a clear political message: zero property tax increases for Vancouver residents. City officials framed this as an affordability measure during difficult economic times. The overall operating budget would increase modestly from $2.34 billion to $2.39 billion. Police services would receive an additional $50 million, but most other departments would face cuts. The planning, urban design, and sustainability departments absorb the heaviest reductions at 14% below current funding levels. According to sources familiar with internal deliberations, these cuts could eliminate entire divisions responsible for processing development, applications, and coordinating infrastructure planning. During interviews about the budget, the mayor addressed infrastructure funding directly, and his response revealed the scale of the problem in stark terms. When asked about the federal government's promise to cut municipal development charges in half while keeping municipalities financially whole, the mayor's response was blunt and frustrated. The city faces a $300 million deficit just for sidewalks, he explained. Someone has to pay for infrastructure. If development charges decrease, where does that money come from? This wasn't a rhetorical question designed for political theater. It's the central dilemma facing Vancouver's housing market right now. The infrastructure exists in a financial no man's land. Too expensive for the municipality to fund from property taxes. Too expensive for developers to absorb through development charges. And too essential to simply ignore. Drop your thoughts in the comments because the presale financing collapse I'm about to explain is the exact mechanism that's killing those 100,000 projects right now. To understand why 100,000 projects sit stalled, you need to understand the financing mechanism that's completely broken. Residential development in Metro Vancouver operates on a model called presale financing. Developers secure land, obtain approvals, and then sell units before construction begins. Those presale deposits provide the equity needed to obtain construction loans from banks. Industry standards require developers to achieve 70% presales before lenders will provide construction financing. This threshold exists because banks need assurance that completed units will sell at prices high enough to repay loans. Without that assurance, construction loans don't materialize. Without construction loans, approved projects remain on paper indefinitely. Here's where the math becomes absolutely devastating. According to data from Rennie Intelligence, investor participation in Metro Vancouver's condominium market collapsed from 50% of buyers between 2021 and 2023 to just 7% in early 2025. That's an 86% decline in the buyer pool that traditionally drove pre-sales. Foreign buyer restrictions compounded the problem exponentially. The federal prohibition on non-resident property purchases extended through January 2027 eliminated another major source of presale capital. Provincial data showed foreign buyers historically represented 7% to 8% of Richmond purchases and significant portions of Vancouver's presale market. That capital has redirected to Thailand, Vietnam, and other Southeast Asian markets with fewer restrictions. Now, layer the infrastructure deficit onto this already fragile financing ecosystem. Development charges in Vancouver fund essential services that new residents require. Water connections, sewer capacity, schools, community centers, parks, transit infrastructure. According to the mayor's public statements, advancing housing development connects directly to infrastructure spending. The city needs senior government funding to pay for infrastructure that comes with new housing construction, the mayor explained in interviews. Without that funding, development charges must remain high to recover costs. But high development charges destroy project economics that are already barely viable. The system is eating itself alive. Subscribe right now because the construction data I'm about to share proves this crisis is accelerating faster than anyone predicted. CMHC data released mid-year confirms the devastating impact. Condominium construction starts in Vancouver fell 13.4% in the first half of 2025 compared to the previous year. Weak pre-construction sales led to cancellation and pausing of projects that failed to meet the 70% threshold for financing. The report notes explicitly that approximately 100,000 approved homes across the region currently sit stalled. Due to financial constraints, Development charges represent part of these financial constraints and create barriers to home building. Provincial regulations taking effect January 1, 2026, will allow homebuilders to defer up to 75% of development charges until occupancy. But deferral doesn't eliminate costs, it just delays them. And delayed costs with interest accumulation can actually make project economics worse, not better. Industry leaders describe the situation in terms that should alarm every Canadian watching this crisis unfold. According to Anne McMullen, president of the Urban Development Institute, condos now cost more to build than 80% of Metro Vancouver residents can afford. When construction costs exceed affordability by that magnitude, project cancellations follow mathematically. And when projects cancel at scale, the housing crisis deepens exponentially, creating conditions for even worse future crises. The implications extend far beyond individual stalled projects. Vancouver's housing market operates as an interconnected system where each component depends on others. Functioning properly, when 100,000 projects stall simultaneously, the ripple effects touch every participant in the market. Landowners holding development sites face carrying costs without revenue. Property taxes, loan interest, and opportunity costs accumulate monthly. Some will sell at losses, others will hold desperately hoping conditions improve. According to data from the Urban Development Institute, more than 22% of land sales over $5 million in the first quarter of 2025 were quartered. That's double the rate from the same period in 2024. These aren't normal market transactions. These are distressed sales where lenders have foreclosed and are liquidating assets. Construction workers lose employment as projects fail to break ground. Rennie Group, one of Metro Vancouver's largest real estate marketing firms, cut 25% of its workforce in early 2025. Westbank Properties laid off 12% of staff. The construction sector's labor shortages, which seemed intractable just 3 years ago, now coexists with rising unemployment as projects disappear. Buyers face a paradox that makes no logical sense. Inventory of completed unsold units climbs while new construction stalls. According to Rennie Intelligence forecasts, the number of unsold condominiums is projected to increase by 60% in 2025 from 2,179 units to 3,493 units. That's the highest level in 24 years. Yet the pipeline of future supply is evaporating as approved projects fail to secure financing. Hit that like button because the future scenarios I'm about to outline will determine whether Vancouver survives this crisis or enters a decade-long depression. The mayor's budget proposal didn't create Vancouver's housing crisis overnight. The $300 million infrastructure deficit didn't appear suddenly. The 100,000 stalled projects result from multiple compounding factors that accumulated over years of policy mistakes, market distortions, and failed assumptions. But the budget does represent a critical decision point. How Vancouver addresses infrastructure funding will influence whether those stalled projects ever break ground or become permanent monuments to failed urban planning. If infrastructure funding remains unresolved and development charges stay elevated, project economics will likely deteriorate even further. More developers will face insolvency. More land will enter court-ordered sales. More construction workers will lose employment. The housing supply shortage will intensify dramatically. Markets eventually find equilibrium. But the path to that equilibrium and the human cost along the way varies dramatically depending on how quickly reality gets acknowledged and how boldly solutions get pursued. By late 2026, historians and economists will look back at this moment as the inflection point when Vancouver's housing market crossed into territory from which recovery became impossible without revolutionary intervention or complete market collapse. The financing mechanisms that powered 2 decades of development have broken beyond repair. The infrastructure funding needed to support new construction remains unfunded with no clear solution in sight. And 100,000 approved projects sit in limbo. While stakeholders argue about who should pay for the essential services those projects require. So, here's my question for you. Can anything stop this infrastructure funding crisis from destroying Vancouver's housing targets? Or are we watching the beginning of the largest failed development disaster in Canadian history? Do you live in Vancouver? Are you seeing construction sites in your neighborhood that started but never finished? Share your observations in the comments right now because the patterns emerging from across the city could reveal exactly how widespread this catastrophe has become. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications because what happens over the next few months will determine Vancouver's future for an entire generation, and you cannot afford to miss a single update. I'll see you in the next one.